In the late 19th century, a cartoonist helped to take down one of the most corrupt and powerful politicians in American history with his sketches. This politician stole potentially hundreds of millions of dollars from the public, but he was also one of the most important people in the development of New York City and transforming it into the nation's most prosperous and culturally vibrant city. But how could a man with so much power who existed above the law for so long be brought down by cartoons? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. You're looking at one of Thomas Nast's most famous cartoons depicting Boss William Tweed, who pretty much ran New York City for a decade and was part of a network that ran the city for about a century. What are you noticing about Tweed, and what's he up to here? Well, I see a towering and darkly drawn figure leaning confidently next to the ballot box, presumably at a polling station where people would vote. The cartoon here is showing how since Boss Tweed controls the counting of the ballots, he controls who holds power. And besides, what are you going to do about it, say? And by the end of this story lecture, you should have a solid understanding of how Boss Tweed and other bosses like him in other cities at the time fed corruption and subverted democracy, and how it was possible for them to do so. And our exploration question for today is, how did Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed reflect the corruption of American politics during the Gilded Age? So, if you remember from our first video of the series, America after the Civil War was in a time called the Gilded Age, and it was a term coined by Mark Twain as a time that might have appeared bright and golden on the outside, right? With all the economic growth and new inventions and productions, but inside it was rotted and infested with problems and corruption. Well, in this lesson, we're going to need shovels because we're going to be digging deep into that corruption that ran wildly rampant at this time. So shovels out, guys. Here we go. Now, another Mark Twain quote from this time was, "What is the chief end of man? Like, what are our hopes and goals? To get rich, dishonestly if we can, and honestly if we must." Not only is Twain here criticizing the material shallowness and selfishness in America at the time, but also the immoral behavior of those cheating their way to get to the top. This was not just those robber barons and corporate pirates who we learned about in episode 1, but it was also the unscrupulous politicians who were working hand and hook with those pirates. But let's start this episode at the top. The corruption seemed to first stain President Grant's administration after the Civil War. And even though Grant himself was not directly to blame, he often seemed aloof or incompetent to address the corruption that was all around him. One of the major scandals was the whiskey ring, which involved, as you guessed it, whiskey producers. They were conspiring to avoid paying taxes by bribing tax collectors who worked for the government, and of course politicians in Washington, D.C. Eventually, this whiskey ring even involved Grant's own personal assistant, but then President Grant helped him avoid facing criminal prosecution by stepping in on his behalf. And also during Grant's administration, but revealing Congress's corruption at the time, was the Credit Mobilier scandal. Credit Mobilier was a railroad company that was defrauding the government of millions of taxpayer dollars. They were doing this by bribing politicians to look the other way and then giving them stock in the company so that they too would profit from the theft of the American people. Remember, this was a time of massive industrial and economic growth, so there was just so much money going around, and many in government wanted to get their hands in on it too. And they were just hoping that the public would be too stupid or uninformed to be hip to it.
So this company stole millions and then paid off Congress? And what? There was no penalty?
Almost, Mahina. It was pretty bad. There were many politicians who were implicated and whose careers were ended, but none of them faced jail time. And though it almost led to the bankruptcy of the company, they still raked in millions. Even Congressman James Garfield was implicated in this scandal, and even though he denied it, he later became president. And he'll be coming back into our story later as someone trying to come and clean up all this corruption at the time, and it's going to get him killed. But the absolute epitome of Gilded Age corruption, greed, and guile was found at Tammany Hall in New York City with Boss Tweed holding the reins. William Tweed was a born and bred New Yorker. But the city he was born into in 1823 would be totally transformed and barely recognizable by the time of his death, and he was involved in many of the city's great transformations. He was the descendant of Scottish and Irish immigrants, and at the age of 11, he left school to work with his father. Early in his adult life, he was a volunteer firefighter at a time when fire companies in the city acted more like gangs or men's clubs, often fighting with other companies to be the ones to put out the fire. Of course, it also happened that some buildings occasionally turned to ash as the brawl was happening outside. And Tweed came to be known as one of the finest brawlers in his company and soon started his own company and took for his symbol the Bengal tiger, which would become symbolic of his time at Tammany Hall. Fire companies were also tied to politicians and could get young men opportunities working with political machines. Political machines were common during the Gilded Age at the local and national level and referred to political organizations that would exchange favors for votes to maintain power in government. It worked like a machine. It kept churning out votes and then they would stay in power. Political machines would often be like chapters or part of a larger party. Like Tammany Hall in New York City was part of the Democratic Party. In 1851, at the age of 27, Tweed was elected alderman for the 7th ward of the city in the country's most notorious, lucrative, and effective political machine, Tammany Hall. And being jovial and charismatic, a real people's person, Tweed quickly worked his way up the ladder. He even served in Congress, but then came back to New York where he thought he could really exercise power. And in 1868, he became the boss of Tammany and had near total control over the budget, city jobs, and awarding contract in what was the world's fastest growing city. Tweed was a hell of a politician. He would walk the streets, shake hands, hand out cigars, kiss babies, and listen to his voters. But even though political machines like Tammany were corrupt, they only worked if they could in fact deliver things that voters wanted. And the reason Tammany politicians were routinely elected in the city was because they offered a lot to the voters. They would help many find jobs. They would help immigrants fresh off the boat to find cheap housing, sometimes help pay their rent, get schooling, and eventually citizenship. And then once citizens, you can surely guess who they voted for. Under Boss Tweed, New York City transformed to a modern city. He oversaw the building of what was the marvel of engineering at the time, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Natural History Museum, the Central Park, and hundreds of miles of roads and water treatment plants and the beginning of the subway system.
So wait, were political machines good then? All that sounds like they were helping the public. Where's my voter registration card? I'm voting Tammany.
Not so fast, Kalohe. Though it is true that they did much to help, they also plundered and pillaged. They often stole elections to ensure that they would win. Remember that cartoon from the beginning? Well, on election day, machine men would run into bars and pay tabs, and they would escort men to polling booths to make sure they would vote. And then they would bribe politicians and voting inspectors if they needed to. His men would get voters registered at several polling stations and on election day ensure that voters voted multiple times. Elections in New York City at the time would have more votes cast than citizens in the city. So do you see how these machines were staying in power? And there was also graft, which is using political power for your own benefit. And with this graft, we're going to see Tweed and Tammany engaging in the wholesale stealing of taxpayer money. And the single greatest example of the swindling of public funds can be seen in the New York City courthouse construction under Tweed. Originally budgeted at $250,000, it eventually cost closer to $13 million, which in today's money would be about $250 million. And in fact, $250,000 is what they spent just on brooms.
Those must have been some fancy brooms. I thought this was the time when hamburgers were a nickel and cars were a quarter. What gives?
Great question. And that is how graft works. See, the thing is, Tweed and other politicians could not just steal taxpayer money and put it right in their pockets. They had to make it look like it was being spent legitimately. So Tweed could hire a company and be insanely overcharged, like $250,000 for brooms. And the broom company would then kick back money to Tweed and they would both profit from the crime. And since the money was accounted for, the public would not be the wiser. Now consider all of the construction work in New York City at the time that the government was overseeing, from sewers and roads and parks, bridges, museums, post offices and harbors and dock repair. And you can see how up to $3.5 billion was stolen in today's money during Tweed's time as boss.
But somebody had to see that things weren't out right and that this was all taking place. Why wasn't anything done for so long?
Great question, Akamai. So you'll also have to remember that Tammany could bribe investigators and police and judges and journalists, and he appointed so many people to their jobs in the city that they were loyal to him and not the law. And this Akamai might have been getting Boss Tweed rich, but it was starting to cause problems at the national level, and it led to the assassination of the president. And that leads us to patronage. And patronage was the practice of awarding political jobs to friends and supporters once a politician was in office. This basically meant that when a new administration came in as either president or maybe mayor, they could award hundreds of thousands of jobs to their supporters and get rid of anyone who would be a political opponent. And this led to tons of people who were unqualified for their posts to be appointed to their jobs just because they were loyal to their party or to that politician. And President Garfield came to power after being elected in 1880, promising to change this and end patronage. But still, hundreds of party members would literally line up outside of his office in the White House day after day looking for government jobs as rewards for supporting him or the party and helping them get elected. But trying to reform this, Garfield turned many down day after day, and get this, was assassinated by a man who believed that he would be pardoned by the new president, Arthur, and celebrated as a hero by all those who now could get their patronage jobs under President Arthur, who was seen as more corruptible. And even after his arrest, he continued to believe that the vice president and the general of the U.S. Army would come to his rescue. "You stick to me," he told the detective. "Arthur and all those men are my friends, and I'll have you made chief of police." The assassin was literally insane, and he was later executed. But more importantly, his assassination of President Garfield led to the passage of the Pendleton Act, or the Civil Service Act, which created a merit-based system where one had to show competency to get a government position. Something that the Chinese had done like 2,000 years earlier. Still, it helped to bring much needed reform to the country. Even before the Pendleton Act, Thomas Nast cartoons were beginning to raise an outcry that would eventually bring down Tweed and Tammany Hall. Thomas Nast was not the first journalist to try to take on Tammany and Tweed for their corruption and crimes. And it was a dangerous game going against such a powerful figure. Many journalists wrote stories and exposés of their fraud and accusations of their criminal behavior, but they did not arouse enough public outrage to create change. And since so many of the political power lied in their hands, they were not easily challenged. But Nast's cartoons exposed Tweed more than the written word could, and he went full throttle against Tammany. Working for Harper's Weekly, Nast created dozens upon dozens of cartoons attacking Tweed, showing him destroying democracy as a criminal who's above the law, the man behind all the corruption and problems of New York, and rigging elections like the cartoon that we started with. This, more than any journalist, got Tweed's attention, and he realized the damning effects that Nast cartoons were having, saying, "I don't care a straw for newspaper articles. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damn pictures." Tweed actually tried to bribe Nast for $500,000 so he'd stop making his cartoons, but Nast declined, saying, "Well, I don't think I'll do it. I made up my mind not long ago to put some of these fellows behind bars." And that's exactly what happened. His cartoons aroused enough public sentiment that serious investigations started to chip away at the Tweed ring and Tammany Hall. Some of those in his circle fled the country. Others were charged and sent to prison. And in 1873, Tweed found himself guilty of 204 charges, including fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and larceny, and sentenced to a 12-year term. However, still having friends in high places, Tweed managed to get a private jail room with a view, and later a 2-bedroom cell with a small library and even a personal assistant, and was allowed carriage rides across the city. Reasonable treatment for someone stealing millions and millions of dollars. And in 1875, on one of his rides, he escaped and eventually sailed down to Cuba and then on to Spain. But when he landed in Spain, he was identified by someone who had recognized the portly figure from Nast's cartoons. He was sent back and lived the rest of his short life in Ludlow Street Jail, behind the bars in the city that he once ruled. So this concludes our unit on the Gilded Age, which was marked by expansion, rising tides of immigration, urban growth, and industrial titans, and the struggle for workers' rights, and wholesale corruption. But all the horrible problems of this time would usher in a new era, an age of reform that sought to address the issues known as the Progressive Era. The pendulum of history swings back and forth. It's reassuring to know that periods of great problems and turmoil is also planting the seeds of renewal and rebirth. And if we are today in the second Gilded Age, maybe we can look out to the horizon and see history there to guide us forward. Thanks for engaging today. This has been History for Humans. If you like what we're doing here at History for Humans, it'd be awesome if you click to show it and also subscribe. But don't go anywhere because we got an awesome lesson coming at you in just a second. Okay guys, we got a great lesson for you today. It's going to involve first analyzing political cartoons of, you guessed it, our man Thomas Nast. And you're going to pick one of the 2 cartoons and then analyze them. There's some level 1, level 2, and level 3 questions that get progressively more challenging and progressively more interesting. So answer those thoughtfully, really kind of dig into and dive into that cartoon and really try to figure out what's going on in it and think critically about it. And then the more exciting and creative part, you're gonna be tasked with creating your own political cartoon. There's a few different topics that relate to Tammany and Tweed and political machines that we provided. So you're gonna choose the one that you like. In your cartoon, first thing you wanna think of is what's the message behind it. Then once you know the message, you might wanna think what symbols are you gonna put in it? Which people are you gonna put in it? Is there gonna be any dialogue in it? And then what is the title of the cartoon? I hope you enjoy it, have fun with it, and we'll see you next time. Take care.